Cultural competency. The learning objectives for this part of the presentation are to be able to describe self-cultural awareness, to be able to identify diversity and demonstrate a willingness to learn about other cultures, to develop skills to communicate effectively across cultures, and to identify the limited value of stereotyping. Before we can describe what cultural competency is, we need to work out the difference between competency versus awareness. Cultural awareness does not result in a change of behaviour. As a result, there is no change in the service delivery. Becoming culturally aware does not include achieving any competencies at all. Unlike cultural competency, it is the ability to identify and challenge one's own cultural assumptions, values, and beliefs. This allows you to develop empathy and allows you to appreciate that there are many different ways in viewing the world as it is influenced by culture. Therefore, cultural competency must be achieved, recognised, and accredited. To become culturally competent, we need to be able to define what culture is. These are the most commonly used definitions of culture. Culture is shared values, beliefs, perceptions of reality and symbols. It changes over time and generations and therefore is not static. How we interact with other people is determined by our cultural experiences and background. And also, culture is an expression of the way we live as individuals, as families, and as communities. Now that we have defined what culture is, we'll cover some cultural differences. The first one is dress. For example, specific clothing such as headscarves or turbans that are worn at all times. Then there are religious practices. Some religions require time during work each day for prayer or time off for special religious days. Customs. Some cultures can or can't have specific foods and drinks, or may have rules about how food is to be prepared. Then we have social values, ideas about appropriate social and sexual behaviour, work ethics, wealth and personal growth, family obligations, high family priorities which may sometimes conflict with work, and finally, non-verbal behaviour, for example, eye contact, silence, facial expressions, hands gestures, greetings, space, and how people interpret them. An example of a non-verbal behaviour that can be easily mixed up is saying yes and no. Here in Australia, most commonly, when we nod our head up and down, that indicates yes. From right to left, side to side, that usually indicates no. However, in the Greek culture, flicking your head up quickly is actually no, while shaking your head in a diagonal pattern from right to left actually indicates yes. Now that we've defined what culture is and identified some cultural differences, we'll now talk about cultural competency. Cultural competency is defined as a person who communicates sensitively and effectively with people who have different languages, beliefs, practices, religions, genders, ethnicities, disabilities, ages, and sexualities. This definition then extends to all people within our community. Cultural competency is not just about communicating with someone from a different country, but also someone with a different upbringing. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, cultural competency is the ability to identify and challenge one's own cultural assumptions, values, and beliefs. To be able to do this, we need to be able to reflect on ourselves. For example, when people look at me, what cultural group do they think I belong to? Why do people make this assumption? What cultural group or groups do I actually feel aligned with? What influences from my culture are the most important to me? And in what way has my culture shaped who I am currently today? We've asked you to reflect on your own culture. So now we're going to look at the Australian culture. This is the Australian culture described when seen from a point of view of another culture. So, from a non-Aboriginal Australian, culture is individualistic and not family-focused. Preoccupation with accumulating material wealth. She'll be right and fair go indicate fairness and equality. Relaxed attitude to life. Australian icons include Anzacs, surf lifesavers and sports stars. There's also mateship and loyalty. Now, is this stereotyping? Stereotyping is a process where we classify someone according to certain characteristics. We see in them what we want to see rather than what is really there. There are lots of common stereotypes around for lots of different cultures. For example, the Australian culture, it's casual and sporty. The Chinese culture is seen as hardworking and diligent. The US, loud and aggressive, while the Middle East is seen as conservative. And the Italians, passionate and explosive. So now we're asking you to reflect again. What stereotypes exist about people in my culture? How do these stereotypes make me feel? These examples are used to increase your awareness of the limited value of stereotyping. A stereotype is an ending point. No attempt is made to learn whether the individual in question fits the statement. While a generalisation is a beginning point, it indicates common threads, but further information is required to ascertain whether the statement is appropriate to the particular individual. Cross-cultural communication. We'll go through some different sorts of communication that can be quite easily mixed up between cultures. The first one is non-verbal communication. For example, shaking the head side to side. What does this mean? In some cultures, for example, the Indian culture, shaking the head side to side is an indication of agreement, not actually saying no. The second one, eye contact, avoidance of eye contact. What does this mean? In some cultures, such as the Mexican, Japanese, Korean, and in many Indigenous Australian cultures, avoidance of eye contact means respect. However, in our culture, the Australian culture, it is usually misinterpreted as not listening or being rude and uninterested. Silence? What does this mean? Arabic people often regard silence as time to collect private thoughts. Some Russians, Spanish, and French regard silence as an indication of common agreement or shared view, while in many Asian cultures, silence is often used as a sign of respect. There are also cultural variations in the interpretation of social issues. For example, marriage and separation. What is the difference? In some Middle Eastern cultures, women regard themselves as not being separated from their husband, even though their husband has actually left, simply because they are still legally married. And finally, cultural interpretation of words. For example, yes. What does this mean? For some people, for example, some Hispanics, yes actually means I'm listening to you, not I'm actually agreeing with what you're saying. Cultural competency is knowledge of the language, customs and values of particular cultures. We're not expecting everybody to be an expert on every single cultural profile. However, if you know there is a group of people in your community that identify themselves with a specific culture, why don't you read a cultural profile and find out some general background information? For example, is the avoidance of eye contact something that they practice? Be tentative. I don't know much about your culture, but is there anything that you think I should know that would help us in any way? And always practice non-judgmental openness and demonstrate respect. So what else would you do in the workplace? As a culturally competent individual, we'll just cover some basic skills that you require to communicate effectively. Firstly, use simple words and avoid jargon and acronyms. Repeat important information as logic may be different to your own. Ask open-ended questions, so you don't get a yes or no answer. Give information in small chunks. Speak slowly and don't shout. And remember, use body language. Over 80% of communication is non-verbal. So, in the workplace, what else would you do to help with communication? In finishing up now, cultural competency is cultural self-awareness, which I hope we've all identified, valuing diversity and willingness to learn about other cultures, the knowledge of language, customs and values of particular cultures, the skills to communicate effectively, and the awareness of the limited value of stereotyping. And finally, we want you to reflect. How is cultural diversity promoted in the organisation that you belong to? Do you think this could be improved? and what suggestions would you make?